This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 4. Welcome to the 4th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility related. And if any of the topics that we'll be talking about today resonate with you, or if you just want to connect with me and say hello, you can tweet me at Fertile Friday. And if you have any comments or questions about today's podcast, please stop by and leave a comment in the show notes for today's episode at fertilityfriday.com/Hannah. And you'll find all the podcasts at fertilityfriday.com/podcast. So today we'll be talking all about non-hormonal birth control methods and how the fertility awareness method can be used either on its own or in conjunction with other forms of birth control. So if you've been considering coming off the pill but are kind of at a loss as to what options are out there, you're in the right place. And I'm so excited to introduce today's guest, Hannah Ransom. Hannah has a degree in nutrition, and after discovering the fertility awareness method for herself, she decided to become a fertility awareness educator. She's the founder of holistichormonalhealth.com, and she has a wealth of knowledge in the area of fertility awareness. So I'm happy to have the opportunity to learn from her today. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Hannah to the Fertility Friday podcast. Welcome, Hannah.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. Very happy to have you. So I did a short intro, but maybe you could tell the listeners a bit about yourself and what inspired you to become a fertility awareness educator.
Yeah, well, I started using the method myself. I kind of heard about it in passing from somebody who had read Taking Charge of Your Fertility, and they were like, this is actually really cool and really great. And I was looking for a long-term method of birth control. And I knew already at that time that I didn't want to get on hormones. I was kind of always really environmentally conscious, health conscious, and I just knew that hormones weren't my deal. So I ended up actually at the same time getting a copper IUD and reading about the fertility awareness method because I wanted to well, at that time, I didn't think that I ever wanted a kid in my life. So I was very much wanting to even double up on birth control and just be very safe. So I learned about it. I thought it was seriously amazing. And I was just, I fell in love with it when I was learning about it. But then I went on to try to chart my cycles, and it lasted all of half of a cycle, and I just stopped. And when I stopped, I think that it was probably due to a couple of things. One of the things is, I don't think, even though I read through all of Taking Charge of Your Fertility, I don't think that my education was really complete enough because I didn't have the perfect textbook cycle. So I think that it was kind of weird and scary to be going through that. And also, I think that there was a lot of fear behind it. We're not told that we can really have any kind of power in our fertility and our birth control. And I think that I had a lot of fear that kind of kept me from fully charting my cycles and learning about it. But then 2 years later, I was just totally fed up with the copper IUD. Like, there were too many side effects, and I was like, why am I doing this to myself? I have this other perfectly good method. So I picked back up fertility awareness, and once I started, like, just committed to it and did it, then I realized how amazing it was. I loved that I was able to get info about my hormonal health, and I loved that I just had this natural method of birth control that really required no outside input. I think that sometimes it can be a good method for control freaks. And
Absolutely. I totally agree.
so having that amount of control over it, with the IUD, I felt like I kind of always thought, oh, what if I'm pregnant? Or what if I'm gonna get an ectopic pregnancy? Such a hard word to say.
Yeah.
But with fertility awareness, I always felt very in control, knowledgeable about everything that was going on. But I also still wanted further education. And that was where I decided to become a teacher because there was no one teaching classes in my area. And at that time, online classes weren't a thing. The only place I could find them through was Couple to Couple League. And I had heard from some people that some of the Catholic classes focused less on the actual method and more on the theology. And I was really interested in getting information about the method. So I ended up studying the method like crazy while I waited for a teacher training program to start. And then I got into that and did a 2-year teacher training program to become a fertility awareness educator.
Okay. I wanted to ask you about that. Where did you train to become a fertility awareness educator?
I trained with someone named Sarah Bly, Grace of the Moon, and she has a teacher training program that she runs every 2 years right now. And I think she's on her second round of students right now. I was in the first round that she did.
Okay, that's awesome. Well, I did have a few things I wanted to ask you. So you had mentioned that you were on the copper IUD for a couple of years
Mhm.
and you stopped because of some of the side effects you were having. I wondered if you wanted to speak to some of the side effects that you experienced.
Yeah, sure. So my main things were that, of course, really common stuff with copper IUD is heavier bleeding and cramps. And before I even got the copper IUD, I really did not ever have anything that could possibly resemble heavy bleeding, and I barely had cramps at all. So I was like, well, I'm probably the perfectly ideal person for getting the copper IUD because if you already have heavy bleeding and cramps, it's really not a good idea to get the copper IUD. But I got it, and well, heavy bleeding and cramps are not fun. So,
No, I can totally relate because for me, my one of my personal issues is that I've always had heavy bleeding and
uh-huh,
excruciatingly painful cramps.
uh-huh,
And so the copper IUD, it wasn't even on my radar because I was like, yeah, it's going to make that worse. No, thank
right.
you. I'm not signing up for that.
Yeah, and I definitely can understand why it's so terrible. So I didn't like that. That was obnoxious. And there was not only the heavier bleeding, but also like a lot of spotting both before and after my period. And I would also get some spotting at ovulation with the copper IUD as well. So, and I knew that because I was always paying attention to my cervical fluid, even though I wasn't charting it after I had learned about fertility awareness. So, anyway, there was that. I was having really weird, like, abdominal pain and problems, and I figured it was probably at least partially due to the copper IUD because it seemed around that time. Um, and I was a happy menstrual cup user before the copper IUD, and then after it started leaking, which I couldn't really attribute to anything because it wasn't like the cup was full, but it just leaked. And I've
Hmm.
actually heard that from a few people who have had the copper IUD, so it's very weird. And then sometimes just painful intercourse because if you got like bumped in the wrong way and you have the copper IUD in, it's very uncomfortable. So, yeah, I mean, I'd say that's the main thing. Oh, and fear of ectopic pregnancy.
Yeah, those are some pretty significant, yeah, side effects. And I think because it seems like the whoever is the lobby to get young teenagers to use the birth control pill or whatever birth control method is the in thing right now, it seems like they're kind of moving towards the IUD.
Yes.
So
Smarter.
it's kind of good to know at least what some of those impacts are because of course none of these birth control methods come without their side effects, so you kind of have to pick the one that suits whatever it is that, is best for you.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you mentioned earlier as well, when you talked about when you first started using the fertility awareness method, was kind of how you found it difficult to trust the method after all of those years of being programmed to be kind of afraid of your fertility, which I can totally relate to.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit about how, I guess maybe how long it took you to fully be able to trust it, and what that process was like?
Yeah, I think that well, I think I had a lot of fear in the beginning, and I think that it's sort of a fear of yourself, or at least it was for me. It was kind of a fear of me not being capable of doing it, not being able to trust myself to do it, being afraid of taking on extra things like taking your temperature every day, checking your cervical fluid, and I think that a lot of it was really fear of my own, really my own ability just as a human to be able to do something like use my own birth control, use my own body as birth control, and being able to trust my body enough. And I think that during those 2 years, I went from, trying out charting for half a cycle before I even ovulated. And I think part of why it was so easy to drop was that I went away on a weekend trip. I didn't bring my thermometer, and that was around the time the ovulation probably happened. And um, I think not seeing your first ovulation probably contributes to making the method easier to drop. Because I think once you kind of go past that, you're like, whoa, my body works. Like, this is cool that I'm seeing what I'm supposed to. But where I see a lot of fear in myself and in other people is fear before you even start. So, like asking yourself so many questions about, oh, will this work for me? Oh, am I going to do it right? Oh, like, is this really going to be effective before you even try? And I think one of the most important things, like, a lot of people will ask so many questions about thermometers and temperatures. And one of the most important things, and I say this in my blog posts, I say this to my clients, but you just do it. And just if you're like worried about drinking affecting it or the fact that you sleep in on the weekends, just just doing it and marking on your chart every time that something is funky and see what happens.
Yeah.
Like it's not necessarily going to be as hard as you think it's going to be. And it certainly wasn't in my case, and it isn't in a lot of people's case, but you can build up so much fear in your head.
Absolutely. I think that's such great advice and such a great suggestion. Because I know when I was first learning, when you're kind of in your head, it's easy to
Yeah,
be afraid. But the interesting thing is that once you start charting, you catch on really fast to how it works. And like you said, when you
right.
see the first ovulation, I know for me, it was all a concept. I had read Taking Charge of Your Fertility. That's how I got started too. And I was like 19, so I was, or 18 or something like that, pretty young. But
Mhm.
as soon as saw the temperature shift, and as soon as you go through a couple cycles and you see it kind of happens every cycle, and
Yeah,
it's like kind of obvious that when it's not kind of obvious, it's totally obvious when you have the temperature shift. And I think that your advice, you couldn't be better stated. Just try it out, and then you'll see for yourself. And any of the stuff that you do, whether it's drinking or whether even if you're sick, you'll just mark it on your chart and it'll make so much more sense.
right. Yeah. Yep.
And so I'm trying to think. There's so many things that I wanted to ask you today, but just so for any of the listeners who might be tuning in for the first time, or maybe they're not too familiar with what fertility awareness is or how it works, let's say if you have a client who wants to use the fertility awareness method for birth control, what does she need to know
Other than how to use it.
other than how to use? Well, yeah. What are some of the basic things, I guess, that a person starting out would have to know?
I think it's important to kind of know what it entails, knowing that, you're taking your basal body temperature pretty much on a daily basis, and no, that doesn't have to go on forever, but um, you know, taking it at least during a chunk of your cycle is a piece of the method, and checking your cervical fluid is the other important fertility sign. Of course, there's also your cervix, but your cervix is kind of an optional sign that I don't think is necessarily that important. I do teach my clients to go through the first cycle, just checking their cervix so that they can kind of tell the difference between when they're fertile and when they're infertile, and then they have that as kind of a backup fertility sign. But I think knowing what it entails so that even though I know that this helps people get up in their heads, which I was just talking about, like stopping, getting up in your head, but just knowing, like, okay, is my lifestyle going to be conducive to this? Because some people will never, they don't care enough about the benefits of it to really take the time to um, learn the method. And I say learn the method because I think once you know it, it really doesn't take much time or thought or energy or anything like that. But I think learning it is a hump. And I think that being able to, not be squeamish about your cervical fluid, be comfortable with your body, trust your body, and to be interested in what your body is doing as well is kind of an important factor in order to start. And then also, it's good to have a partner that's on board and that knows about the method. Um, if you're partnered, if you're single, obviously you could use the method as well. Um, it's of course better to use it with condoms in that case. But
Naturally.
but yeah, I think that those are really the important thing is just to kind of be able to assess your own ability to use something like that and learn something like that and be happy and comfortable with that.
Yeah, and it kind of leads me into another question I wanted to ask you, which, because of course, there's no one right birth control method for everybody. I mean, some people have an amazing experience with, say, for example, the IUD, and some people swear by the pill, whereas other people swear by the fertility awareness method, like I do.
Yeah.
And so, if if someone's thinking about whether or not the fertility awareness method would be a right fit for them, what types of things would you say to that person? Or maybe you could talk a bit about how our listeners might know if the fertility awareness method might be the right choice for them.
Yeah, I think with that, a lot of times I kind of just, when someone's asking me about that, they usually ask me about some kind of, um, usually specifics about the method. And a lot of people are really concerned, I'd say first, about the efficacy of it. And I think that that's something that's obviously normal to be concerned about with your birth control method. With fertility awareness, one of the things that I love so much, and one of the reasons that I was looking into it when I was like not wanting to have a child at all in my life, was because it is very, very effective as long as you learn it well and use it correctly. So, of course, learning it well involves learning it with an actual fertility awareness educator. And I say that this because all of the studies that we have done on fertility awareness that actually show good efficacy are all from people who have actually learned it from a person and had follow-ups with them. So that's a really important piece of it. Um, from what I've seen, all of the studies that I've seen that teach very, very short little things of the fertility awareness method. I haven't actually seen any studies from people learning it from a book, so I don't really know how that translates, and how well the effectiveness is there. But uh, yeah, I'd say that's really important, learning it well and then using it correctly. And I think everyone can maybe think about the way that they would use it and be able to use it correctly in their own heads and in their own lives. So for some people, they know that there's no way they're ever going to want to use any kind of barrier methods during their cycles, nor are they going to want to abstain or use alternate sex. So if they don't want to do any of those things and they're unwilling to go through any period of time that they have to have protected intercourse during their cycle, then that's not going to be the right method for them. Like it's just not going to work. They're not going to be happy. They're going to hate the method, and they're probably going to use it incorrectly and then get pregnant. So, it's really a lot about what you personally value. And then also people ask a lot about whether having irregular cycles, it will work for them. And with irregular cycles, the method still works. It still has the same efficacy because with this method, you're not basing it on counting days, you're basing it on your fertility signs. And your fertility signs are going to be there regardless of how short or long your cycles are, or how heavy or light your periods are, or any of that stuff. But the thing is that with irregular cycles, a lot of times you will have a longer fertile phase, potential fertile phase. Your actual fertile time isn't going to be any longer, but the time that you could be fertile based on your fertility signs could be longer. And that is one of the reasons that a lot of people, once they start using fertility awareness, start working on their hormonal health, honestly, is because they're like, hey, I want a shorter fertile phase. Like, this kind of sucks. Um, so I think that that's important to look at, because you might have a period of time before you can really get your hormonal health under control, that you're going to have a longer fertile phase. But the good news is that fertility awareness also helps you get your hormonal health under control because you can see what's going on with your hormones, and you can also see how they change when you apply different diet or lifestyle to them.
Well, there's so many things that you said there that are amazing. So I want to kind of unpack it a little bit. I know you mentioned that once women start charting, one of the challenges can be that their fertile phase can be a bit longer, and so you're talking about the mucus cycle and how if maybe your hormones aren't perfectly in balance, your mucus cycle might be a bit longer. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that and how it can be a challenge when women are starting to chart.
Yeah, so I would say, first of all, cervical fluid is generally the more difficult fertility sign for most women to understand. And um, with that, I think that there's sometimes an over reliance on temperatures, which is unfortunate because cervical fluid can tell you so much about your hormones and is more important in terms of charting, than your temperature is. But really having a good teacher is important to understanding your cervical fluid a lot of the times because different women can see different things. And this especially is true if your hormonal health is subpar, just you have some kind of hormonal imbalance. But even between healthy women, you can see different things. So some people might see I say textbook example just because so many people read Taking Charge of Your Fertility coming into this, but that is based on sticky, creamy egg white. I do not have sticky, creamy egg white. That is not a thing in my life.
Yeah, I don't have
And
sticky either. I can.
yeah, I'd say a lot of people don't. There are people who fit into that beautifully, but uh, it's not super common. And so having someone who can ask you questions about your cervical fluid, um, and figure out what you really saw and like help you really understand that is really important. And when you have a hormonal imbalance, a lot of times your cervical fluid can not only look different, or appear differently than you would think it should, but a lot of times it will be for longer. And that's because one of the more common hormonal imbalances is having a lot of estrogen and little progesterone. And um, the when you have less progesterone, you can see your cervical fluid sometimes after you ovulate for longer than you should. Um, Also, when you have not necessarily even a lot of estrogen, but sometimes you'll have longer times having smaller threshold of estrogen. So you'll start having cervical fluid, which is estrogen is what creates the cervical fluid, and then it will all of a sudden start drying up a little bit, and then you'll have more, or you'll just have kind of this low level of cervical fluid for a longer time than the normal fertile phase. And you can see that your hormones are maybe needing some help because you're seeing this on your charts, but that's also part of the reason that you have like this longer fertile phase, even though you're not fertile for any longer because your ovulation is still just happening on that one day a cycle.
But then, of course, if you're using the method for birth control, you still have to consider all those mucus days to be fertile. So then
Right.
it draws out your fertile window because, of course, if you have mucus coming and then it dries up and then you have mucus again, then it. So yeah, that makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense. I wanted to ask
Yeah.
you, because we were talking about the sticky and the creamy and the egg white, and I know that when I started using taking charge of your fertility, I was checking internally. Um, do you think that the way that whether you check internally or externally can make a difference in those signs and make it less clear or easier, I guess?
I think a lot of people get confused when they check internally, because a lot of people will say, I wasn't finding anything or I wasn't finding much, so I decided to check internally. Um, and to that, I ask, what is not much? But but there's I think that there's merit to it certainly for some people. I think that it can also make it a lot harder and a lot more confusing. Harder because it is a lot more work to do an internal check than an external check. An external check, you can just take toilet paper. Anytime you're wiping, you're feeling if you have cervical fluid, then you can check with your eyes and your fingers. It's very simple. But with an internal check, you kind of have to prepare. You have to wash your hands. You have to actually purposely just check your cervical fluid. And then you can, use your eyes and fingers to look at it. But then on the confusing factor, a lot of people will confuse vaginal cell slough with sticky cervical fluid. So it's really important for people who are checking internally to distinguish between the two. And I think that it's probably easier for people who are doing internal checks who are actually distinguishing between the two to not notice cervical fluid than someone who isn't doing internal checks because I think it'd be easier for your earlier cervical fluid to think, oh, this is just vaginal cell slough.
And what is
But
vaginal cell slough, just for anyone who doesn't know?
so it's basically something that you're always producing in your vaginal canal, and it's to kind of keep out any kind of bacteria, infections, anything like that. And you kind of have a layer of it. It's kind of lotiony, and like anytime you do any kind of internal check, you're almost always seeing it on your fingers. Um, Usually it's whitish if there's like more of it. If there's not a lot of it, sometimes it'll just be like an almost clear, like lotiony layer. But most people see it when they do internal checks, and being able to really distinguish between the two, I think is the trick if you're doing internal checks. If you're doing external checks, I think it's a lot easier to distinguish between the two, but I think a lot of people just get paranoid when they're not seeing a certain thing that they think they should see with external checks. But if people aren't seeing cervical fluid at all with external checks, I think it's better to address hormonal health, potential hormonal health issues, um, than to say, I don't know, I just can't see it doing external checks, so I should do internal checks.
Yeah. No, I think that the point that you made about how how learning with a fertility awareness educator can help to clear some of that up, especially because so many people have been on the pill, and that can obviously impact your hormonal health. And so when starting to chart, maybe your charts aren't as straightforward. So
Yeah,
that combined with challenges in learning how to check and figuring out the way to check, it seems so simple, but there is actually a bit of a technique. And I know when I
yeah,
learned through Justice, and I learned the external method to check with toilet paper, after having years of checking internally, um, I just found it to be I found it to be more clear. I found it easier to identify a dry day. That's, I guess, what it comes down to, right? Like,
right. Yeah.
versus kind of sometimes being confused and uh, and so one of the things that you mentioned earlier was how how fertility awareness can be suited for control freaks. And
Hmm.
I'd love to get that idea out there. For me personally, I just like you said when you were on the IUD, you kind of were always like, "Am I? Could I get pregnant? Could I get an ectopic pregnancy?" And you were still checking your mucus. The thought of being on the pill or any other type of birth control pill for me now would not give me the control I need, because at
Yeah.
least I know now. I know exactly what's going on every day. And then also, if I did get pregnant, I would know immediately. Like, not immediately, but I would
Right.
know, like,
Yeah.
within day 12 after ovulation, day 13, even day 14, I would know. So just thought I'd throw that in there. And just to kind of maybe switch gears a little bit. So for anyone who is considering the whole concept of going off the pill or using the fertility awareness method, maybe we could talk a little bit about how the fertility awareness method can be used in conjunction with some other forms of non-hormonal birth control. So what it kind of looks like in real life when you're using it with a partner and you don't want to get pregnant.
Yeah. So I mean, this seems super basic, but a lot of people who aren't familiar with fertility awareness don't know exactly how it works. So, fertility awareness, you're basically identifying the days that you are potentially fertile in your cycle, and then during those days, you either abstain, use some kind of alternate sex, or use some kind of barrier method of birth control. And on the days that you are not fertile, you can safely have unprotected intercourse, and that has, if you're abstaining during your fertile time and not abstaining during your non-fertile time, that has over 99% efficacy. But if you are using a barrier method or something like that during your fertile time, then you just have the effectiveness of whatever that barrier method is. And the reason I say it like that is because, well, none of the barrier methods are as effective as fertility awareness with perfect use. So even if you're using the barrier method perfectly, which hopefully you would be because it's during the fertile time in your cycle, and if you don't want to get pregnant, that would be the smart thing to do.
Gives you that
Um,
added motivation to use it properly.
right. So if you're using that during your fertile phase, then I mean, you have slightly less, like let's say you're using just a condom, you would have slightly less than 98% efficacy because with the few point percent of down for fertility awareness, and then with the 2% for the condom, that's kind of how it would add up. Now, some people decide to also use a barrier method differently or withdrawal or something like that. So, since the part before you ovulate in your cycle is a little more likely to be the time that you have that small percentage of unintended pregnancies during. So some people will, only use withdrawal until they are actually in their fertile time. And then during their fertile time, they'll abstain or double up on birth control methods. So that could look like, using withdrawal and a condom or something like that. And then only after they've ovulated and they're out of their fertile time, then they have unprotected intercourse. So there's like kind of endless combinations with fertility awareness, and that's one of the things that I love about it is that you really have such good control over knowing exactly when you're fertile, knowing exactly how perfectly or imperfectly you're using the method, knowing exactly how careful you should be with any kind of barrier method, and knowing like if you did have any kind of mess up, like for instance, you're using a condom during your fertile phase and you absolutely don't want to get pregnant and the condom breaks, well, then you would probably be very concerned about pregnancy and go from there with however you want to proceed with that, whether that's like taking plan B or whatever. But I think that's pretty much, well, I think it's essential information to really know and understand your cycle because of the way that you can proceed with birth control because of it. Even if you don't plan on using it as your primary method of birth control, having that knowledge of your body helps so much, even with whatever method of birth control you did choose to use, unless it was a hormonal method, in which case you're shutting down your hormones and you're not going to be figuring out what your body's doing.
Yeah, side note, you can't really use the fertility awareness method if you're on hormones because there's nothing to really watch in
Yeah.
that case. You mentioned that if the condom broke or if you had a issue with the barrier method you were using during your fertile time, then it would inform you to know, what you had to do about it. And then on the flip side, say that you were using a condom outside of your fertile window after ovulation, just, to double up to be safe. Or I think one of the myths about fertility awareness too is that you can only use it if you're in a committed relationship. So
Yeah.
say you're like playing the field and you're, having sex with your partner for the night using a condom, and say the condom broke, but that you're in your say you're past ovulation, you're in that window where you can't get pregnant. That also informs your choice because you don't otherwise maybe you would have run out and took plan B regardless, but now
Right.
you kind of know that, okay, well, I don't have to take plan B because I know I'm not fertile. I might have
Yeah.
to go
But
get a
maybe
test
you
for
should get an
STIs.
STI check.
But at least I know I don't have to douse my
Right.
body with that one time um, hormone
Right. And I
issue.
think just having that knowledge and like is invaluable because I know so many people that will take they'll use things like withdrawal or condoms, or some people will even use a hormonal method and condoms, and then if the condom broke or they didn't use a condom, they would take Plan B.
Yeah.
And
So it's kind of like the
which
same
to
thing.
me is nuts.
Yeah.
But but I mean people do it, and I mean I think a lot of it is we have a lot of fear about our fertility, and we're taught in sex ed that like we can just get pregnant so easily. And yeah, I think people can do whatever they choose to do, but I think it's I think having, especially if you're not on hormones, because if you're on hormones, again, you can't use fertility awareness, but like if you're not on hormones, but you really don't want to get pregnant right now, um, fertility awareness is like it's almost necessary. Like it's just so good to have, and it will give you so much peace of mind that,
Yeah.
yeah, it's
It's
invaluable.
it feels like the ideas out there are that it's so unreliable and all that kind of stuff, but having used it, I couldn't imagine not having that information. Like I couldn't imagine being in the dark. Like
Yeah,
control freak's dream. I know everything.
right.
I might not be able to control when I ovulate, but I know when it's coming and I know when I'm fertile. Uh,
Yep.
and so I loved your post about about withdrawal. I thought it was just such a great conversation to have about it because it's just one of those things, just like you said in your post, that it's kind of discounted as a birth control method at all.
Hmm.
However, on the low, people use it, right? Like it's
Yeah.
this thing that people do, but
Right.
they don't talk about because it's like you're not supposed to do it or something.
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about that and how it works and maybe how effective it is or how to use it, quote unquote,
Yeah.
properly.
First, I would like to mention because I don't know, I just always feel like this is something that when you don't talk about it, I think there's kind of like a danger around not talking about birth control clearly. And with withdrawal, you'll hear a lot of people say that they don't use any birth control method. Um, and they really use withdrawal, and that's how they haven't gotten pregnant in so long. But they call it not having a birth control method. And I also see this with people who use less effective methods, like using spermicides or using um, herbal methods, which we really don't know the efficacy of. And they will say, oh, well, I've used this for birth control for this long, and it works great. But really, um, what they are using as well and what has the higher efficacy is withdrawal. But they're not mentioning that. So people could go out and use that and not implement that whole withdrawal part of it and it not work out as well for them. Um, so I think it's kind of important to talk about because so many people do use it a lot. I have a lot of people as clients who uh, will be using condoms in quotes, and they're totally sick of using condoms, but they don't want to be on hormones and they don't feel like they have any choice. They feel like all they have is condoms, because a lot of people don't really know that much about female barriers, and
And apparently
yeah,
you can't find a doctor to prescribe a diaphragm anymore, so I've read.
right. I just had a client with a big problem with that told me this whole horror story, basically. So, Yeah, that's really depressing, actually. But uh yeah, so I'll have a lot of people who will be using condoms in quotes, but they're kind of using withdrawal. And they'll say, "Oh, I'm not always using birth control," you know? And you're
Yeah.
like, "What? You're not always using birth control? That's not good." But then it turns out they're using withdrawal. Um, and I think, I do think it's given a really bad rap. And part of that is due to, teenagers and sex ed, and because we, in the general sense, don't want teenagers using withdrawal because they're probably not going to be as good at withdrawal as maybe people who are more experienced. But that's not to say that they probably couldn't get really good at withdrawal if they tried.
Yeah.
Um, so a lot of people have this fear about it and that it's not really a method, but really, if you use it correctly and you use it every time, it's 96% effective. The problem is if you're not using it correctly, there's nothing else there. Like if you're not using it correctly, you're just having unprotected intercourse. So that's why when you're not using it correctly, the failure rate goes up dramatically. And that's one of the reasons that it's not as recommended by a lot of healthcare professionals and stuff like that. But I, I'm often really surprised by the things that doctors recommend. Like my client recently that was trying to get a diaphragm. The doctor told her basically that he didn't want to fit her for it, that he didn't think that she would like remember to put it on in the heat of the moment and whatever, which is totally awful and something that doctors should not be involved in at all. But he told her to use spermicides.
Hmm.
And I was like, spermicides? Those are less effective than diaphragms. And he said, basically, all a diaphragm is just like a little cup to hold the spermicides. And I was like, no, it's not. It's
Wow.
far more effective. Yeah, and I can't believe these are doctors that have been, practicing OBGYNs that have been practicing for, I think she said 20 or 30 years, this guy. And I'm like, okay, let's open up contraceptive technology and let's look at this because that's totally incorrect information.
That's
But
just scary.
yeah, I mean, I think that people need to examine that everyone has their biases,
Yeah.
and I if you get stuck with some kind of healthcare professional that has their biases, like they're not necessarily going to be looking out for what's best for like the individual you. They're going to have their ideas of what's happened in the past or what happens in their head, and they're going to dissuade you from certain things.
Well, and for what it's worth, when you go to a doctor, they usually have 5 minutes or so.
Right,
So it's not like they're really going to do a thorough, like, examination of all the possible options of birth control and to figure out
right.
what's going to work best in your life. It's really up to you. I did want to ask you because you mentioned the 96% statistic, and I'm sure that at least someone who's listening heard that and thought, what? Everything I've ever read has said 70% or less. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, I guess, what perfect use would look like and just a little background about how it can be 96% effective. Because if people
Yeah,
knew that, then they would know that you could actually use it as birth control.
yeah. I tend to, when I'm talking about birth control, use the perfect use statistics with all of them. But I tend to always say before I say the statistic with perfect use.
Yeah,
And
every
part of
time.
that, Part of that is because I really don't think that it's hard to be a perfect user of almost anything. I think that it would be a little bit hard to be a perfect user of the pill personally. Like, I just don't think that I could take a pill at the same time every day. But I really think that we kind of undercredit women, um, well, particularly women, but men a little bit too, in terms of what they're capable of. And I think in that way, it makes us actually a little bit less likely to be perfect users. Especially as teenagers, when you hear like, oh, condoms suck and like you're not going to use them very well, so get on the pill too. I think that's going to make them less likely to become perfect users of condoms. And of course, that's a problem in terms of STIs, but it's also a problem in terms of just being a perfect user of any kind of birth control method. Um, so with withdrawal, yeah, so anyway, that's my tangent about perfect use. But with withdrawal, basically being a perfect user includes always withdrawing before ejaculation, um, not getting any ejaculate on the vulva or in the vagina. So, that includes like if you're getting ejaculate on your hand, not playing around with the vulva with your hand. If you are getting ejaculate on your body somewhere, that it's nowhere close to your vulva, nor is it going to go down to your vulva. Um, and if you are, yeah, those are the main things. Like, basically, it's just that there's no actual ejaculate coming into contact. So, like, in any way that that could happen, it's not happening. And the way that that could still produce that 4% failure, even if you are using it perfectly, is that some men and women have the combined fertility of being able to get pregnant off of some sperm that might be in pre-ejaculate. One other thing that I didn't mention about perfect use is that if you are having intercourse like one right after the other,
Yes.
you would want to make sure to urinate in between.
And a
Um,
little wash off wouldn't hurt.
right, right. Um, because you're basically creating some amount of pre-ejaculate, and that, um, while scientifically it's really not conclusive, but it's not really supposed to contain sperm. It's basically just supposed to kind of alkalize your urethra and then have it so that any sperm that are coming out with the ejaculate aren't getting killed off by like an acidic urethra. Um, but it seems that sometimes it does contain sperm. For some men, it seems like for some men, they don't have sperm in their pre-ejaculate. So it could be that for some couples, it works better than others.
Mm.
And certainly, if you've gotten pregnant using withdrawal perfectly before, it's probably not a good idea for you to use withdrawal again. If you really don't want to get pregnant.
No.
But if you aren't sure that you were using it perfectly, well then, that could have been the problem too.
Well, and I think the fertility awareness method, like in conjunction with whatever you're using, whether it's a condom or whether it's withdrawal or a diaphragm, if you can get a doctor that will prescribe you one, I think that the great thing about it is that because you can identify your mucus days, your fertile days, then you can be even more cautious. I feel like it gives you just that, like you're not gonna mess around on the day that you have like all this peak mucus, right? So I think it's so good to
Yeah,
know, because
maybe
I
not.
don't maybe not, maybe you will because you're probably extra horny on that day.
Yeah.
So
I
But
mean, I like now I just say it. At first I never said it. But anyway, I use withdrawal all throughout my fertile phase. And like I don't know, it's worked for me, and that's not to say that it would work for everyone, but
oh,
it's
I
been
have
fine for me.
two. I have two.
Yeah.
I tend to um like if there's a day that is like just dripping wet with like egg whites, like peak mucus, I tend to maybe shy away from um from actual intercourse on that particular day.
Mhm.
But for otherwise, yeah, I'm
Yeah.
also coming out of the closet.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily advocate for it, but I don't necessarily advocate for anyone to use any particular form of birth control. Like, I want there to be open information so that people can make the best decision for them. I obviously love fertility awareness, and I obviously think it's an invaluable tool, but I don't think that it's necessarily right for everyone. But having the information about it is super important so that you can make the right decision for you. Um,
Well, and I think it's also good to have that conversation about withdrawal because I don't feel like it's a conversation that's had. And for what it's worth, I think that that stuff we were told in junior high about how just easy it is to get pregnant at any time,
mhm.
that's obviously not true. But then also when it comes to getting pregnant, um, I don't know all the specifics about withdrawal and which men have enough sperm in their pre-ejaculate to result in conception and which men don't. But there's a reason why ejaculate contains millions and millions of sperm, and
Right.
it's because in order to conceive, there needs to be many sperm.
Takes more than one.
Yeah, it takes more because half of them are in the wrong tube.
Yep.
Half of them don't even make it up there, and so
Yep.
yeah, like the
And then it
chances are
takes
very slim.
multiples, actually like eating away at the whatever around the egg, to for one to finally get in there and
Exactly.
fertilize it. So
To break down
yeah,
the barrier around the egg.
I mean, there's a reason that people with a certain sperm count, like they still have sperm, but they're considered infertile. And that doesn't mean that they can't conceive because it is possible. It does happen. And that's why there's also that um, failure rate with withdrawal. But it's also not super likely as long as you're doing it right.
Yeah, and then there's the flip side of women who do know when they're fertile, and then like you said, like they have sex on those days, and their partner fully is ejaculating inside, and maybe they don't get pregnant that cycle. So it's
Yeah.
not to say that because I feel the same way as you do. I'm not advocating for it or not, but I think it's important to open up that conversation because if you're having sex and your partner is withdrawing and there's no ejaculate anywhere, the chances of you getting pregnant are slim. Of course, there's still a chance,
Right.
but it's
There's
slim.
always a chance
There's always a chance,
with
but
everything.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess to kind of wrap up, I just have one or two questions for you today. Um, and so for someone who's considering the fertility awareness method but is afraid to make the leap, so maybe they're on the pill, but they've been on it for so long that they just can't imagine being off of it, what would you say to her?
I think that it would depend on kind of why they wanted to come off. If they were feeling like they were not happy on the pill, but they were just kind of afraid of their ability to use the method correctly, I would probably just be encouraging and say, like, first of all, it's not forever, just learning something isn't there's not it's not going to decrease from the quality of your life. um and being able to kind of just educate yourself, learn about your body for a while, and see how you feel when you're off of the pill, um, might be important uh, to kind of making that decision for yourself. Um, then there's also people who are worried about coming off of the pill because of side effects. For them, I would say uh, follow my advice in my coming off hormonal contraceptives post. And no, but really,
I'll link to that in the show notes.
if you follow decent like hormonal health tips kind of before you go off the pill, you'll probably have a smoother transition. Still, you can totally be in like hormonal upheaval at the time. But it's not forever again. Like I think we tend to attach some amount of permanence to everything, thinking like we're never going to get out of it, but it's really important to um it's really important to just know that like it's not, and you'll get over the side effects, and you're gonna have to come off of them at some point, whether that's gonna be like menopause or when you want to have a baby or whatever. Like that's gonna have to happen at some time. And like if you're thinking that you're gonna want to have a baby in the next couple of years, well then why not come off, deal with any kind of hormonal upheaval and imbalance you have first, and then like you'll have an easier time, you'll be knowledgeable about your body, whatever. And if you're gonna have to come off of them at menopause, well, that would probably be not fun because you're going through also a lot of hormonal change with menopause. So I would say the sooner the better in terms of side effects.
Yeah, and getting all the hormonal situations figured out and getting yourself
Yeah,
healthy.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And last question for you today. What's your favorite app for charting?
Well, I personally don't use an app. Um, I just use paper because I find I'm probably the only person that thinks it's harder to put my information in on an app, and I like being able to see it completely on paper. But I favor Kindara in terms of ones that I've used. Groove seems pretty cool too, but that one's just for iOS. Kindara is now on Android and iOS, so that's a good
Nice.
one. I like it.
Well, you're not alone. I used paper for many, many years. I just recently switched over to the apps.
What
So
do you use?
I use Kandara actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like it because I can shut off the predictor and I can actually do what I
Yes.
need to do.
And that's why I like it. No prediction.
The only thing the only thing I was missing the other day was I don't know how to draw a cover line. But maybe they have the functionality and I just don't know how to use it, or maybe it's a functionality they might add later on. So,
Yeah, I'm not sure if they. I'm trying to remember if I've ever seen like a client's chart with a cover line on it.
not that it's super important,
Dara.
but that was the only thing I couldn't do. That's what I always used to draw my cover line with a ruler on my chart. So, um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Kendara is good though because like we were talking about the non-prediction thing. So for people who don't really know, the reason that I personally think that it's good to not have the predictions, I know that it sounds like, but I want the predictions. Like I need that. But a lot of times if you have anything slightly weird in your cycles, the predictions will mess up. Um, and it's really easy to want to favor what the technology is saying over what your body is saying. And
Yeah.
it's kind of better to at least start on paper, I think, to kind of get that trust for your body down before you kind of go into the technological rabbit hole.
I think that's a really good point because I feel like with all this stuff floating around, um, most women would probably err on the side of the predictor, um,
Right.
which is not the best way to go because the app is not going to tell you when you have mucus. You have to actually check your vulva. You have to wipe and actually check to see if there's mucus down there. So,
Yep.
well, on that note, Hannah, I'd like to thank you so much for hanging out with me today and
Yeah.
sharing your
Thanks for
knowledge and
having me.
experience. Um, Yeah, it was really cool. You're so easy to talk to, so I had a lot of fun.
So I had fun too.
And I'm sure we could chat for hours about fertility awareness. Um,
Yes.
but yeah, I'd love to have you back on the show sometime, maybe later on, because I'm sure you have so much more to share. How can our listeners get in touch with you for questions or to find out how they could work one on one with you if they're thinking of getting instruction from a fertility awareness educator?
Oh yeah, you can go to holistichormonalhealth.com, which is my website, and that houses articles that I write and stuff like that about fertility awareness. And to access my program, you can go to herfertility.com. And that basically will take you from knowing zero about charting to being a competent, happy fertility awareness charter. And it's really awesome. And right now, if you want to work on me one on one in terms of consulting, you just have to get in touch with me because I don't have anything super easy to sign up sign up for right now, but yeah, you just have to shoot me an email and all of that info is on my website.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Hannah, and I'll talk to you soon. Well, thank you so much for listening. You're awesome. You made it all the way to the end. I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed today's episode, please tweet me at Fertile Friday or stop by the blog and leave a comment in the show notes for today's episode at fertilityfriday.com/Hannah. And you can also find the show notes for all of my other podcasts at fertilityfriday.com/podcast. You can find me on the Fertility Friday Facebook page as well, and that's facebook.com/fertilityfridays with an S. So until next time, be well and happy charting.